This meant you were rich in the 1960s. Think being rich in the 1960s meant diamonds and limousines? Think again. Sometimes all it took was a second bathroom or a color TV to turn heads. Let's rewind to a time when everyday luxuries told the world you'd made it without saying a word. The second car. Back in the 1960s, having two cars in the driveway wasn't just convenient, it was a full-blown statement. One car meant you were doing just fine, but two? That was the dream. That second car said something loud and clear. This family had made it. Most households back then managed with one vehicle, usually Dad's, used for commuting to work or running the big errands. But when a family had another set of wheels just for Mom, or for weekends and showing off, that was next-level living. It meant freedom, flexibility, and a touch of luxury. I remember hearing a kid at school say, "My mom has her own car," and the rest of us stood there stunned, like he just told us she had a yacht parked out back. And if that second car was a Cadillac? That wasn't just comfort, that was prestige. Those cars glided down the street like royalty, with tail fins so sharp they looked like they could take off. Cadillacs weren't just transportation, they were symbols. Owning one said you didn't just have money, you had style. More than anything, two cars changed how a household worked. Mom didn't have to wait for Dad to bring the car home just to get groceries or visit a friend. She had keys of her own. That freedom reshaped the day-to-day rhythm. The dishwasher. Back in the 1960s, having a dishwasher in your kitchen wasn't just about convenience. It was a full-on status symbol. If you walked into someone's home and saw one humming away under the counter, you knew right away. These folks were doing well. Most families were still scrubbing pots and pans by hand, stacking dishes in the sink after every meal. But if you had a machine to do all that work for you, that meant you'd made it. Dishwashers were shiny, modern, and a little bit magical. They gleamed under the kitchen light like a piece of science fiction brought to life. People didn't just use them, they showed them off. Guests would comment, relatives would whisper, neighbors might just happen to stop by and ask for a look. It was more than an appliance, it was a conversation piece. And let's be clear, dishwashers weren't cheap. At a time when every dollar counted and people prioritized practical needs, spending hundreds on something that just washed your plates meant you had money to spare. Ads from the era didn't shy away from that either. They promised ease, elegance, and a little bit of glamour for the American housewife. In a world before microwaves and smart homes, the steady hum of a dishwasher felt like a promise of the future. Flying for leisure. In the 1960s, flying on a plane wasn't something most folks did casually. It wasn't routine. It wasn't cheap. It was an experience. One that came wrapped in elegance, excitement, and a little bit of envy from everyone watching from the ground. If your family flew somewhere for vacation back then, people didn't just ask where you were going, they assumed you were doing pretty well for yourself. Most families piled into the old station wagon, packed snacks in a cooler, and drove for hours, sometimes days, to get to their destination. But if you were stepping onto a jet, that was a whole different league. You were heading to places like Disneyland or Miami Beach in style, high above the clouds. And it wasn't just about the destination, it was the whole affair. Airline tickets were expensive, often more than a week's wages for the average worker. And once you got to the airport, everything sparkled. Travelers dressed to impress, with men in suits and women in heels and gloves. Flight attendants, still called stewardesses, wore tailored uniforms and offered full meals with silverware and glassware. It all felt so polished, so refined. Flying for fun in the 60s didn't just mean you could afford a vacation. It meant you were part of something elite. It said, without saying a word, "We've got it good." And for those lucky enough to experience it, the glamour of air travel was unforgettable. The American Express card. Back in the 1960s, there were a few subtle ways to show you'd made it. And one of the most powerful was slipping an American Express card out of your wallet. It might seem simple now, but back then, that little card spoke volumes. It wasn't something you saw every day. In fact, most people never even held one. See, credit cards weren't mainstream like they are today. Most folks paid with cash, or maybe a personal check if they had to. But an American Express card? That was reserved for the select few. It wasn't just about paying for dinner, it was about making a quiet statement. Pulling out that card at a nice restaurant or a hotel front desk turned heads. Waiters noticed, guests noticed. It said, "I'm part of a different crowd." And when American Express launched the Gold Card in the mid-60s, that message got even louder. The Gold Card wasn't just for buying, it was for belonging. Belonging to a world of fine dining, first-class flights, and five-star stays. American Express didn't hand these cards out to just anyone either. High fees, strict requirements, it was all part of the mystique. Your own bedroom. If you were a kid growing up in the 1960s and you had your own bedroom, you might not have known it at the time, but you were living the dream. Seriously, having a room to yourself back then? That was a big deal. For most families, the norm was cramming 2, sometimes even 3 kids into one space. Bunk beds, shared dressers, and lines taped down the middle of the room to mark your side weren't just common, they were expected. So when a kid had 4 walls, a door, and a little space to call their own, that wasn't just luxury, it was next level. It meant the family probably had a bigger home, maybe even a split level or ranch with that elusive extra room. Not a converted sewing corner or storage closet, but a real full-sized bedroom. And that space? It became sacred. Kids got to choose paint colors from the Sears or Montgomery Ward catalog, or beg for Snoopy wallpaper and shag rugs. You could pin up posters, stack comic books, and keep your treasures right where you left them. Best of all, you could shut the door. That one little detail gave you something precious. Privacy. What was the biggest status symbol in your neighborhood growing up? The second living rooms. Back in the 1960s, nothing quietly whispered, "We're doing all right," quite like having not 1 but 2 living rooms. Most homes made do with a single space where everything happened. TV watching, dinner trays on laps, kids doing homework on the floor. But if a house had a second room that was purely for looks, that was a whole different story. This was the formal living room. And believe me, it wasn't for lounging. You didn't sprawl out in there with a bowl of popcorn or flip through TV channels. In fact, a lot of the time, you didn't sit in there at all. The furniture was pristine, often covered in thick plastic that made a loud crinkle if you dared to shift your weight. The curtains stayed drawn to protect the upholstery from fading. The carpet? Vacuumed in perfect lines. Everything had its place, and it stayed there. That room was for guests, for holidays, for special visits from relatives or the pastor. It was a room that said, "We take pride in our home, and we can afford to." The second bathroom. In the 1960s, nothing said, "We've made it," quite like having 2 bathrooms under one roof. It might sound simple now, but back then, that second bathroom was pure luxury. Most homes built before or right after World War II had just one. One toilet, one tub, one sink. And if you had a big family, you felt that. I still remember lining up outside the bathroom in the mornings, lunchbox in hand, doing the classic hurry up dance while my sister perfected her bangs for the 5th time. That bathroom was a battleground. So when someone casually mentioned they had a second one, maybe even a guest bathroom, you couldn't help but be floored. It sounded as extravagant as having a separate fridge just for soda. But here's the thing, it wasn't just about avoiding arguments. A second bathroom meant comfort, convenience, and most importantly, it meant money. Whether it was added onto the house or came with a new build, it was an investment. Plumbing wasn't cheap, and homes with 2 bathrooms didn't come around every day. For parents, it offered a sliver of privacy. For kids, it meant fewer morning meltdowns. And for visitors, it made an impression. You didn't need to brag. That second bathroom did all the talking. It was modern, it was practical, and in a time when space was sacred, it quietly said, "We're doing just fine." The color television. In the 1960s, nothing turned heads or turned neighbors green with envy, like a color television. If your family managed to bring one of those into the living room, It wasn't just another appliance. It was a glowing symbol that you were ahead of the curve. You didn't just watch TV, you experienced it. Most folks were still watching black and white sets, squinting through static and fuzzy images. But then came color. Bright, bold, and almost surreal. It was like watching the world open up right in your living room. Suddenly, Bonanza wasn't just a Western, it was a cinematic event. The wonderful world of Disney? It truly became wonderful with all those colors leaping off the screen. And the price? Let's just say color TVs didn't come cheap. In the early 60s, buying one could set you back several $100s. That's weeks or even months of pay for most families. But for those who made the leap, they became the talk of the neighborhood. Friends and neighbors would come over just to watch the big game or a holiday special in full color. It was a shared experience, and a little peek into a future everyone wanted. Some families even had more than one TV, and that was something else entirely. That wasn't just luxury, that was a statement. Because back then, a color television didn't just change how you saw the world, it changed how the world saw you. TV Guide. Long before streaming, VCRs, or even the luxury of a DVR, there was one way to stay ahead of the television curve, and it came in the form of a glossy little magazine by the checkout line. In the 1960s, picking up a copy of TV Guide wasn't just a convenience. It was a quiet nod to being in the know. If your family had it sitting on the coffee table, you weren't just keeping up with your favorite shows, you were part of something modern, something a little more polished. Sure, most folks made do with the listings printed in the local newspaper, but TV Guide? That was next level. It didn't just tell you what was on, it showed you. Full-color photos of your favorite stars, interviews, behind-the-scenes gossip, and episode previews made it feel like Hollywood was stopping by for a visit. I still remember flipping through it on lazy Saturday mornings in my pajamas, circling my must-watch shows with a red pen while nursing a glass of Tang. There was something exciting about planning your week around those listings. Something official. And in a time when TV was scheduled and you either watched it live or missed it entirely, TV Guide gave you a sense of control. It made television feel important. It made you feel prepared. And maybe, just maybe, it said your household had its act together. Central air conditioning. In the 1960s, stepping into a home cooled by central air wasn't just refreshing, it was like stepping into the future. Most folks were still battling the heat with box fans humming in the windows or clunky, loud window units that barely cooled the room they were in. But central air? That was something else entirely. It was quiet. It was even. It was luxurious. And more than anything, it was rare. I still remember the first time I walked into a house with central air. It didn't just feel cooler, it felt fancier. The air moved gently, like the house was breathing. Everything inside felt cleaner, crisper, more put together. Even the furniture somehow looked better in that perfectly chilled space. It was the kind of comfort that made an impression, and people noticed. If an HVAC truck pulled into someone's driveway, the neighborhood grapevine lit up. "Looks like the Thompsons are upgrading," someone would mutter. Translation: they're doing well, because central air wasn't cheap. It took a big upfront investment, not to mention the electric bill every month. You had to have a steady income and some cushion to afford it. But for those who could swing it, central air was more than just a comfort. It was a quiet kind of status symbol. In an era where people didn't flaunt wealth, the cool air did the talking. It said, without a word, "We're living a little better than most." Which of these 60s luxuries did your family have? Or wish they had? The two-story house. In 1965, if you wanted to spot the fancy house on the block, there was a simple trick. Just look up. If it had stairs, chances were that family was doing pretty well. In a decade when ranch-style homes were popping up everywhere, one floor, low to the ground, simple and efficient, the two-story house stood out. It didn't just say, "We have more space." It said, "We've moved up in the world," literally and figuratively. Those extra steps meant more bedrooms, more privacy, and usually a bit more style. Maybe even a den tucked away in the back, or a formal dining room that only got used on holidays. I remember going over to a classmate's house once. He had an upstairs playroom and his own bathroom. I thought I'd stepped into a hotel. And the intercom system on the wall. That felt like something out of the Jetsons. But the real luxury of a second floor was the separation it offered. Parents downstairs, kids upstairs, grown-up space and kid space. That kind of layout gave everyone room to breathe. And in a time when square footage was a point of pride, those stairs were more than just architecture. They were a symbol. A subtle way of saying, we've made progress. We've got choices. The in-ground pool. By the mid-1960s, if your family had an in-ground pool in the backyard, you weren't just beating the heat, you were making a statement. Most folks were out there running through sprinklers, hosing down the sidewalk, or driving to the local pool with towels slung over their shoulders. But the lucky few who could step outside and dive into their own private oasis? That was another level. These pools weren't just a luxury, they were an investment. Digging one in, pouring the concrete, installing the pump system. It cost a pretty penny, and the expenses didn't stop there. You had to keep it clean, pay the utility bills, and maybe even hire someone to maintain it. But for those who could swing it, worth every dime. I still remember the Patterson family 2 streets over. Their pool had underwater lights that shimmered after sunset, a diving board the kids fought over, and even a little tiki bar set up where the adults sipped drinks that definitely weren't just iced tea. Come summer, their backyard turned into the neighborhood hotspot. Cookouts, pool parties, music playing through those big wooden speakers. It felt like something out of a postcard. Above-ground pools were nice. But an in-ground pool? That was elegance anchored in concrete. It said your family didn't just survive the summer, you owned it. The boat. In the 1960s, the ultimate flex wasn't a flashy car or a big house with 2 bathrooms. It was owning your own boat. And not just a beat-up rowboat or something you drag to the lake on the weekends. We're talking sleek, gleaming cruisers. A Chris-Craft with polished wood, chrome railings, and a name like Seabreeze or The Escape painted across the stern in perfect script. That was the dream. Most families back then spent their weekends mowing the lawn, working on the car, or fixing up the house. But if you were pulling a boat behind your Cadillac or had one docked at the marina, that meant you were living in a different world. A world with leisure time, extra income, and a taste for the finer things. I still remember the day a neighbor pulled onto our street with a stunning Chris-Craft behind his car. You could smell the varnished mahogany before he even shut off the engine. The whole block came out to look. It didn't just look expensive, it felt expensive. Like something straight out of a magazine ad. Owning a boat wasn't just about having fun on the water, it came with real costs. Maintenance, fuel, marina fees, and insurance. That's why only a select few could swing it. Even chartering one for the weekend was a luxury. The Housekeeper. In the 1960s, if your mom wasn't mopping the floors, stirring a pot roast, and hollering at you to set the table all at once, you might have had something special, a housekeeper. And let me tell you, that wasn't common. That was next-level living. Most families ran a tight ship, usually on one income. Moms wore a dozen hats: chef, maid, chauffeur, referee. Every chore done by hand was a point of pride. So when a household could afford to bring in someone to help with the cleaning, that wasn't just about convenience. That was a clear signal that your family had a little extra padding in the bank account. I still remember going over to a friend's house where everything sparkled. The windows were so clean you'd think there wasn't any glass in them. The carpets had those perfect vacuum lines, not a speck of dust anywhere. Their housekeeper wore a neat uniform and even addressed my friend's mom as ma'am. It felt more like a hotel than a home. But it wasn't just about the spotless surfaces. It was the sense of order, the calm, the polish. In a time when guests could drop by without notice and appearances mattered, a pristine house made an impression. And having someone else help keep it that way? That quietly said, we're doing more than fine. Private school. In the 1960s, nothing stood out more at the bus stop than a kid in a neatly pressed blazer, polished shoes, and a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. While the rest of us waited in hand-me-downs and scuffed sneakers, that kid looked like he stepped off a magazine cover. And where was he headed? Not to the neighborhood school, but to a private academy miles away. Back then, sending your child to private school wasn't just about education. It was a full-blown statement. Most families trusted the local public schools, which were often overcrowded but decent. Private schools, though, they were on a different level. Uniforms, classical curriculum, small class sizes, and tuition bills that could make your eyes water. These weren't just schools. They were launching pads. I remember a boy in our neighborhood who went to a prep school out of town. His dad drove him every morning in a shiny Buick Riviera. His lunch came wrapped in waxed butcher paper, not a brown bag like the rest of us. His shoes were always spotless. He didn't just look different, he lived different. Private school meant more than just Latin and algebra. It meant structure, status, and access. Parents weren't just investing in learning, they were buying into a future of polished manners, high expectations, and high-powered connections. And for families who could afford it, it was one of the clearest signals of all. We're not just getting by, we're building something bigger. Thank you for watching. To continue with more content, comment 1 to let us know you're still following. The vacation home. In the 1960s, if your family had not one but 2 refrigerators, one in the kitchen and another up at the lake, you were part of a very exclusive club. That second fridge usually meant something bigger, a second home. And let me tell you, in a decade when most folks were focused on paying off just one mortgage, owning a vacation property was the ultimate sign that your family had arrived. It didn't matter if it was a rustic cabin in the Adirondacks, a beach cottage near Cape Cod, or a cozy spot tucked away in the Smoky Mountains. Having a place to get away was no small feat. These homes weren't just for show. They came with all the responsibilities of a full-time residence. Upkeep, utilities, furniture, linens, dishes, and yes, an extra fridge, usually stocked with Cokes and cold cuts for the weekend crowd. I still remember a kid from our neighborhood who spent summers at his family's place on Lake Geneva. He'd come back with mosquito bites, a stack of Polaroids, and stories about tubing, bonfires, and cookouts by the water. The rest of us? We stayed in motels or campgrounds when we could afford it. But he had a second address. The fur coat. In the 1960s, if you saw a woman glide into a room wrapped in fur, you didn't have to ask questions. You knew. That coat wasn't just for warmth, it was a declaration. While most winter coats were all about function, wool blends, heavy buttons, and collars that barely kept the chill out, a fur coat was something else entirely. It was elegance, it was luxury, it was quiet, undeniable status. Whether it was a full-length mink that brushed the knees or a cropped fox jacket with a satin lining, fur meant you'd made it, or you married someone who had. These coats weren't impulse buys, they were chosen with care, sometimes gifted for milestone anniversaries, and often passed down like family treasures. I still remember the year my cousin's fiancé showed up to Christmas in a fur coat. The room actually fell silent. It shimmered under the tree lights, swaying with every step like she'd just walked off a movie set. And the cost? Let's just say you could feed a family for months on what some of those coats cost. Even storing and maintaining a fur was a commitment. Special cold storage in the off-season, professional cleaning, and handling it like fine china. In the 60s, fur wasn't just fashion. It was a symbol of arrival, a tradition, a treasure, and a little slice of Hollywood right in your hometown. When she walked in draped in fur, she didn't have to say a word. That coat said it all. The hi-fi stereo system. In the 1960s, if your family had a hi-fi stereo system sitting in the living room, you weren't just playing music, you were making a statement. These weren't little radios on the kitchen counter, no, these were furniture. Long, sleek wooden consoles, sometimes 6 feet wide, finished with polished veneer and gleaming like something you'd see in a showroom. A hi-fi system didn't just play records, it turned your house into a private concert hall. You drop the needle on a Dean Martin LP or a Dave Brubeck jazz session, and suddenly, it was like they were right there in the room with you. Warm, rich, room-filling sound that wrapped around you like a cashmere blanket. Music wasn't just background noise, it was an event. I remember my neighbor's dad proudly showing off his Macintosh amplifier. The thing looked like a control panel from NASA, glowing tubes and all. It sat behind glass like a museum piece. And heaven help the kid who even thought about touching it. These systems weren't cheap. They cost serious money, and building up a record collection to match? That was a hobby for the well-off. Most folks made do with a tabletop radio or a simple record player. But if you had a hi-fi setup, that meant you didn't just love music, you had the money to make it sound just right. The flocked Christmas tree? In the 1960s, nothing said holiday glamour quite like a flocked Christmas tree. You know the kind. Bright white branches dusted with artificial snow, standing tall in the living room window like it had been flown in straight from the North Pole. It wasn't your average tree. It was a statement, a showpiece. And back then, it cost a little more than just chopping one down from the local lot. Most families like mine settled for a simple green tree. Maybe a few string lights, some homemade ornaments, and if you were lucky, a paper star on top. But the folks with a flocked tree? That was different. Every year we'd drive by the Wilsons' house just to see theirs. It sat in the big front window, glowing with silver tinsel, color-matched ornaments, and those hypnotic bubble lights that looked like lava lamps trapped inside a Christmas bulb. It wasn't just festive, it looked expensive. Mrs. Wilson once told my mom it had been professionally flocked at the garden center and came wrapped in plastic to keep it pristine until decorating day. That detail alone? Pure luxury. It wasn't just about having a tree, it was about creating a holiday display that made people stop and stare. The riding lawn mower. In the 1960s, nothing quite turned heads in the neighborhood like someone gliding across their front yard on a riding lawnmower. That wasn't just yard work, it was a performance. While most families were out there on Saturday mornings, sweating behind a push mower and dodging rocks, the folks with a riding mower looked like they were starring in their own suburban parade. These machines weren't cheap. Brands like John Deere and International Harvester sold models that could run several $100s. And in those days, that was real money. But the point wasn't just about making the chore easier, it was about making a statement. In the post-war suburbs, a manicured lawn had become a new kind of status symbol. And the riding mower? That was the crown jewel of curb appeal. I still remember Mr. Anderson down the street. He'd roll out in neatly pressed khakis, give a little wave like he was riding in a convertible, and mow his lawn with the kind of precision you'd expect on a putting green. His yard looked like it was groomed with scissors. It was so perfect it made the rest of us feel like we were living in a jungle. Some families didn't even mow at all, they hired gardeners. That was next level. Whether you were riding behind the wheel or paying someone else to do it, a flawless lawn told the world something simple. We've got the time, the tools, and the money to make it look easy. Which of these signs of success do you remember, or maybe even lived through? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this trip back in time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out more from Past Not Past. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.